tuning in from. That'd be really great to get a sense of where everyone is based. I'm tuning in from London today, so I'm speaking to you from the UK, and we're just waiting for Brittany from Go Overseas to join us. I can see that they just joined. So if you'd like to share where you're tuning in from, that'd be great. Okay, let me see. Accept.
Hi there.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really great to
Yeah.
be having this conversation. And it's fantastic to see so many people tuning in. We really look forward to everyone sharing their questions and comments. So welcome
Yeah.
everyone. My name is Miriam Kamali. I'm the Advocacy Manager at Freedom United. As I mentioned, I'm tuning in from London in the UK today. And Freedom United is the world's largest community taking action against all forms of modern slavery globally. So, as we close out National Human Trafficking Prevention Month in the US, I'm really pleased to have Brittany from Go Overseas join us to discuss the harms of orphanage volunteering, the links to orphanage trafficking, and how the tourism sector can be an ally in tackling this issue. So we would also love for all of you tuning in to join the discussion. So please do, if you haven't already, share your questions in the comment box at the bottom of your screen. And if you're following along on social media or posting, please use the hashtag #EndOrphanageTrafficking, and you can tag us at Freedom United HQ and at Go Overseas. So just to give you guys tuning in a bit of background about the Freedom United campaign, and orphanage trafficking. Some of you might have already taken action in the campaign. You might already be aware of what orphanage trafficking is and how it occurs. But for those of you who might be wondering how orphanage trafficking is still perpetuated today, and why this is such a big issue and why we're working with organisations like Go Overseas to tackle this issue, I'll just give you a brief background. But before I do that, I would like to just open today's conversation by acknowledging that volunteering abroad can be an incredibly rewarding and useful experience, both for volunteers and the communities that welcome volunteer work. So what we're wanting to bring with today's discussion is an opportunity to just reflect and question where we are potentially causing harm despite our best intentions, and how we can identify those areas. On the face of it, it might not always be immediately obvious how volunteering in an orphanage or donating to an orphanage links to orphanage trafficking. So when we talk about orphanage trafficking, what we're referring to is the process by which children are taken to live in an orphanage or an institution under false pretenses, particularly when there's no need for a child to be under institutional care, because they may have a parent or a family member who is able to look after them. And extensive research has been carried out over many, many years by many organisations into the harms of orphanage trafficking, how it happens, and also the links to orphanage volunteering. So when families are perceived to be more vulnerable due to economic circumstance, for example, traffickers know that they are able to exploit these families by offering to take their children away, give them an education, supposedly, and better life opportunities. Instead, what we're seeing and what happens is that children are placed in institutions where they're exploited. Children may be particularly at risk of physical and emotional sexual abuse, and children are also forced to work and essentially perform for volunteers that are volunteering in the institution. And this repetitive cycle can be a really lucrative one for traffickers. The funds that orphanages receive from foreign donations, as well as through volunteerism placements, make orphanages essentially an attractive business opportunity at the expense of children who live there. So when we think about the scale of the problem and how many children are in orphanages around the world, there are an estimated 5 million children who are living in orphanages and institutions globally, despite the fact that 80% of these, in fact, have a parent or family member who could look after them with the right support. So when we think about these two numbers, there's a very clear disconnect. That's why at Freedom United we decided to launch our campaign back in 2018 with a request to volunteer tour operators offering placements in orphanages, requesting that they no longer do so, that they remove mention of orphanage volunteer placements on websites, and commit to stop working with these orphanages in the future. So over the past few years, the Freedom United community has taken action by signing the petition and getting in touch directly with volunteer tour operators offering these kinds of placements, as the evidence base has just continued to build, and we've been seeing story after story of children continuing to be exploited in institutions globally. I'd also like to make the point that it's not just about donations. So in Ukraine, for example, there was a case of an orphanage worker who was found guilty of attempting to sell a girl under their care to an organ harvester for the equivalent of around $10,000 US. And again, in 2020, in the United States Trafficking in Persons report, it was also noted how foreigners were sexually exploiting children by donating to orphanages and offering to pay their school fees as a means of gaining access to these children. So in the same year, there was also various different cases in Nigeria, and an orphanage trafficker was eventually prosecuted by authorities. He was found to be abducting children and duping families into giving up their children under the guise of providing them with care and an education again. So we're seeing a pattern of these stories happening across the world, which is why it's so important for us and so key to work with tourism and the tourism industry in building understanding around how traffickers exploit the incentive provided by volunteering in orphanages. So having said all of that, Brittany, thank you so much for joining us, and it would be great if you could explain a bit more about the work that Go Overseas does and the new system that you've implemented to flag harms of orphanage volunteering.
Yeah, of course. And first of all, I just want to start with number one. Hi, everyone. I'm Brittany, and I'm the product developer at Go Overseas. And I just want to thank Freedom United for just having a really open and honest dialogue with us. I think it's been really enlightening for us to find our voice in this space and figure out how we can also push your mission forward to help orphanage trafficking end globally. And so I think it's been a really good experience for us. So just want to thank you for involving us there. And a little bit of background about Go Overseas. So we're really a community-centered resource for programs abroad. So we like to say that we're kind of like the Yelp for programs abroad. And we'll be focusing in more on that volunteer portion today, but we also have like internships, teaching opportunities, TEFL courses, etc. So some of the background behind why we decided to implement this alert system was in talking with Freedom United. We wanted to make sure that we were understanding that like volunteering can be a really incredible experience for a lot of people. That has never changed. Volunteering can be incredibly impactful for the community that you're visiting and also for yourself. But there are underlying things that people just didn't have the information for. They didn't understand that sometimes your impact can be negative. And so we wanted to make sure that we're putting that information kind of front and center for people to make really informed decisions, because at the end of the day, Go Overseas is there to give people all of the information to make the best decision for the community and also for themselves. And so we thought that there was like a little bit of a gap between the information that we were giving. So we decided to work with Freedom United to, first of all, write an article to get that information front and center for our community, talking about how to find the right volunteering program for you. What is the right program for the community? What is the right program for you? So there are a lot of questions that we asked when we were writing that article. And then the alert system on the programs. So basically, this was a way for us to call in the community and also call in our providers and give them a space to say, this is how we approach volunteering, and then give them the space to like go and look at their programs, take a hard look, get in touch with Freedom United, connect the two of them, and make sure that they were doing everything that they could to have the best program possible. Because obviously that's our goal, to make sure that everybody is having meaningful travel experiences. So we, on the alert system, all of the providers that have pages dedicated to how they approach ethical volunteering and how they're holding themselves accountable, how they are putting their values front and center, they have a space to do so. And then we also have that article linked in there so that you can read and find out what is ethical volunteering. I think for myself personally, for a long time, like I didn't understand, like, what are the questions that I should be asking? Like, how do I know if this is a good program? And so we wanted to give people all of those resources to say, this is the type of program that I'm looking for, and feel really confident moving forward in that decision.
Thank you, Brittany. Yeah, and the flagging system that Go Overseas have set up, it's so important because, as you mentioned, it really provides people who may not be aware of these harms of volunteering in orphanages. It provides that educational element to actually just
Yeah,
explaining why we really advise against volunteering in institutions, and that is a really crucial piece of seeing the tourism sector as a whole shift away from offering these kinds of placements when
yeah,
we're building awareness and building education across our
yeah,
communities.
yeah,
And I think what's also important to note as well is that we are seeing a shift in the way that the international community is understanding orphanage volunteering and understanding the links between volunteering in orphanages and how it's being formally recognised as a form of modern slavery and trafficking. And it is encouraging to see the international community recognising how volunteering in orphanages can put children at risk of trafficking. And
yeah,
over the past few years, we've seen this awareness increase, and it has been quite noticeable. In 2019, the UK, for example, issued official travel advice flagging the harms of orphanage volunteering and making that link to orphanage
yeah,
trafficking. Um,
yeah,
and I think, as well, when we're seeing at the international level, the UN putting out a new resolution to the Child's Rights Convention, calling on states to take action to implement strategies to prevent orphanage trafficking and prevent the institutionalization of children. It's incredibly significant, and we're really hoping to see more organisations really follow the lead of Go Overseas in taking steps to raise awareness as well.
yeah.
Um,
And I really see it as like two pieces is how I've been thinking about it. Is there's like the internal piece, which happens from like providers thinking for themselves, like, what is it that we need to do? And like, how do we go through this process? And for each of our community members, like, how do I get involved in this conversation? That's getting involved with Freedom United, or figuring out like what types of programs do I think I should be going on? What programs do I think will have a meaningful and lasting impact on the community as well as myself? And then there's that external piece, which is communication about it. And I think that can be really daunting for a lot of people, is to get involved in the conversation. And I know for myself, I'm thinking about like, this is a really big conversation. We want to make sure that we're approaching it with sincerity and honesty, and like making sure that it's always this really open, honest conversation. And that should be happening at this level with organizations trying to push this mission forward, and also between a community member and another community member, that just talking about volunteering overseas, or communities and providers asking really thoughtful questions about that programs values and how they approach volunteering in different communities and stuff like that. So I really see it as like there's an internal piece and an external piece around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it would be interesting to hear as well from your experience of working in the tourism industry and particularly on volunteer placements. Do you think that we are seeing this heightened awareness from
Yeah.
the organisations you work with or you partner with around the harms of orphanage volunteering?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that you can see that even with the alert system, with people pushing their like putting their um, ethical volunteering pages up on the site. I think that there's still a lot of like space for us to grow. I think that we've gotten a few providers in touch with Freedom United where they can talk about like this is what we've done, but we don't know where to go. And I think that that's that communication that we want to see where people aren't just like afraid of the conversation, but they're actively looking to like learn and grow and change. Um, but we've seen, at least from our internal conversations with providers, that they are really kind of stepping up to at least like learning more and then trying to figure out like what those next steps are. And I think 2020 was a big year of change just across the board for travel. And we saw obviously a lot happening with the pandemic and racial injustices. And so many things were happening that it kind of became a catalyst for people to really look into their companies and their own personal views and say, like, what's missing and like, what can I do differently? What can I do better? And how do I show the world that like I want to be the best that I can be. So I think that 2020 was like a really big catalyst for social change for companies specifically. So I think that we are seeing a heightened awareness, but I still think that there's a lot of room to grow for us.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, your analysis of the past few years, I completely agree with. I think what we've certainly been seeing over the pandemic is this desire to change and rethink about the way that we're doing things. So, I absolutely agree that from the tourism industry side, where of course travel was completely disrupted, um, it would be, triggering those same kinds of conversations. Um, I mean, what do you think still needs to change in order to get to where we want to be, which is orphanage volunteering is just no longer something that's accepted or widespread?
Yeah, I think that it's a lot of it's more conversation. I think that a lot of I think most of our providers have been aware of this conversation for a little bit, and trying to get more and more involved in how do we change our programs and how do we make sure that they are in line with our values. So I think a lot of that has happened. Um, but I think that there is this like, how do we put that out there externally? So we've seen providers start to create pages and say like, this is how we view it. I still think that there are a lot of organizations out there that haven't done anything like that. Most of the internal conversations that we have are people actively doing that work. Um, so I think that there's that piece. I think that there's taking a hard look at their programs and saying like, how do we make sure that this is exactly where we want it to be? And then tell our community that like, yes, this is a very ethical program. This is going to have a lasting impact on the community, a lasting positive impact on the community and yourself. And like, how do we put that information out there? So I think one of the big pieces is providers being really open and receptive to that conversation. But I also think that making sure that our community knows like what questions am I supposed to ask? Like when I approach a volunteer program, what am I supposed to learn from them? How do I ask those questions? And I think, Miriam, in your article for us, you actually brought up a quote from, I think it's Dr. Kate Von Doer.
Yeah.
And she lists these questions I think are really great. So I'm going to list a couple of them. Where and how are they registered, and how are they focused on supporting children and families? And to me, those are like great questions to start asking providers. And again, I think there's this daunting element to how do I how do I ask those questions? And I think it's just that open and honest dialogue of just ask the question. Just say like, hey, I want to make sure that I'm making the right decision for myself and for the community. I have a couple questions, and opening that up, I think, is such a big next step for everybody in the community. And I think that we should really be putting those questions front and center so that sometimes the community doesn't have to ask. It's just like very readily available. Like, here's how we approach these different, very nuanced questions. So I think that that's kind of the next step is uh, giving the community the questions that we should be asking to make sure that they know and can feel confident in the decision that they've made for volunteering. And also just giving that information really readily from programs. Where and how are you registered? How are you focused on supporting children staying in families, etc.?
Yeah, exactly. And I think there might be some hesitancy from some organisations, working with orphanages or,
Yeah.
directly, um, you know, being institutions or orphanages themselves,
Yeah.
around, there's this need, or perceived need to have volunteers there in order to support this work. And I think what's really key to remember is that redirecting this energy that people have, to support children, but redirecting that away from institutional care and towards these more community-based solutions, which is what we really want to be seeing. This can, really go a long way in helping break that cycle, of exploitation. Um, so I think, we still have a long way to go, but there is certainly, it's really encouraging to be able to have these conversations with, organisations in the volunteerism industry. And it is encouraging to hear that awareness is growing as a whole. Um, I think as well it would be interesting to explore whether there's been any pushback or if there's been any, concerns raised by any partners
Mhm.
that you know of, um, and what some of the solutions could be.
Yeah, I think right at the beginning, there was definitely some concerns around putting this flagging system up. And people, the biggest pushback there was that they were like, no, but we have done a lot of work here. And like, how do we show that this isn't the program that you think it is? Like, how can we tell people that this is a very different type of program? And that's where we really decided, like, we want to call providers in. We want them to feel like, hey, we want to grow. We want to also educate ourselves. We want to feel empowered to make changes to our programs or to showcase how this is a program that's going to have a lasting impact on the community. And so that's when we really decided, okay, we should make sure that this system can showcase what the provider is doing. If they are taking really meaningful steps, they should be able to showcase that as well. So I think that from all of the conversation that I've had, that was the biggest pushback is they were like, wait, we really do want to show what we've been doing to make changes to our programs. Like, we want the community to know that this is a problem out there and we're taking it really seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think an important point as well is, we're not suggesting by any means that, all orphanages are linked to human trafficking or engaging in human trafficking. Um, Simply that the evidence is so clear, and is so damning around how institutional care endangers children, and puts them at greater risk of trafficking, that it's simply not worth the risk to actually go and volunteer in an institution.
Yeah.
And I think this is why it's so crucial to be getting that message out there that by removing this financial incentive, of turning sort of volunteering orphanages, into this kind of business opportunity, for traffickers, I think is really crucial.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the other big things, and I know that we've sort of done this with this flagging system, is getting providers in contact with organizations like yourself so that that conversation is happening on multiple levels. So that, I mean, when a conversation is always coming up, it's really hard to not think about it all the time. So if we're having this conversation, you're also having conversations with other programs or providers. Um, it's a lot harder, or it's a lot easier, honestly, for them to make sure that that's incorporated into all the work that they're doing. It's easier for them to look at every single thing with the lens of, is this the right, like, is this a good program? Is this an ethical program? And to keep that top of mind all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thanks so much, Brittany. We are going to open the floor for any questions or comments. So if you would like to share a question, please do pop it into the comment box at the bottom. We have received a few questions that you guys have sent in, so we can just dive straight into those. So the first one is, what impact has the global lockdown and the varying orphan systems in countries had on the general orphanage trafficking statistics? So I can have a go answering that one. So firstly, it's very difficult to come by accurate statistics on the true prevalence of, number one, the number of children in orphanages, and number two, the number of children in orphanages who have been trafficked. This is for a number of reasons, but for example, there are increasing numbers of unregistered orphanages popping up. The covert nature of trafficking means that it's also quite difficult to identify accurately how many of these children are exhibiting indicators of trafficking. What we do know is that the pandemic put already vulnerable communities and those experiencing exploitation, in increasingly precarious situations. So when we think about the structural drivers of trafficking, orphanage trafficking and otherwise, such as poverty, families may have experienced job losses and things like that. So the added stresses that the pandemic has had globally, we can safely assume has simply not helped prevent trafficking in any scenario. Brittany, is there anything that you would like to add or answered in response to that question?
No, I think you're right. I think it's really hard to figure out what those like true numbers are with, again, as you said, the covert nature of how this all tends to work. Obviously, traffic has taken a big decline over the past years in varying capacities. And as we slowly start to kind of resume travel, I am hoping that a lot of those changes that providers have made as they've, looked internally, or that dialogue that's begun to happen, all of the education that's been out there, hopefully that takes a decline as travel starts to incline, but it's hard to know right this second.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question is, as there is always too much work and too few resources, how can we work together towards preventing orphanage trafficking? Brittany, would you like to answer that, or I'm happy to go as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really big first step, even just getting this flagging system up. And I think um, I think this was a really good show of what collaboration can do, because there is always going to be limited resources. There's always going to be too much work to do. So how can you lean on somebody that has more expertise than you? And obviously we have a lot of expertise and industry knowledge on the travel industry and experiential education as a whole, but Freedom United really has the handle on how the volunteer industry interconnects with orphanage trafficking. And so there was a very clear relationship that could be made there to say, like, how do we use each other to kind of further our mission to have meaningful travel being, I don't know, how can we use each other to make sure that meaningful travel is happening globally, and making sure that the impact that you have is positive and is a lasting impact on the community and yourself. to kind of keep going back to, because I think that there's really quick impacts on yourself and quick impacts on the community, but I think that more importantly is like, how can you make a lasting impact? So I think that this flagging system has been really a great start there. But I think what I was saying earlier with getting Freedom United really connected to other organizations in the industry and making sure that we're all having this sort of conversation. So it's not just the two of us, but it's in the entire industry. Everyone is talking about it, and Freedom United doesn't even need to be involved in every single conversation because it's happening all the time in every space. So I think that getting connected across the board is really kind of the next step for me.
Yeah, of course. And I think one of the ways in which we can get to that place, and everyone who's tuning in and everyone who's ready to take an action in the campaign, is that if everyone is raising awareness, if everyone is educating themselves on how orphanage trafficking occurs and taking action, then there would be hundreds of thousands of us ensuring that this issue maintains its momentum and is kept in the spotlight, so that we can keep raising awareness in a more sort of sustained way, which is what we really need to see.
Yep.
So the next question is, how do governments oversee the roles of child protection, immigration departments to collaborate to protect orphans vulnerable to trafficking? So I would say that this would absolutely vary country to country. It's very country specific. As I mentioned earlier, it's really great that we are beginning to see in the past few years recognition at the international level and from certain governments on accepting that there is a link between orphanage volunteering and orphanage trafficking. Now, what we really want to be seeing is states being transparent about what strategies they have or plan to have in order to implement measures set out, for example, in the resolution that I mentioned in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So whilst we have these high level sort of recommendations, we really do need to be seeing states actually implementing this into their domestic frameworks. But yeah, as I mentioned, this is definitely context specific, so it does vary. Great. And then the next question is, does volunteerism play a role in orphan trafficking, and if so, in which ways? So we have covered a little bit, how volunteerism does contribute to orphanage trafficking. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term, volunteerism is the practice of combining voluntary work with tourism and travelling abroad. So essentially, it just provides this financial incentive, as we mentioned, that people can then exploit. Brittany, was there anything else that you wanted to add, or any other comments?
Yeah, I think we mentioned this right at the beginning, that there are really impactful ways that you can volunteer overseas that will have positive impacts. And then there are ones that can lead to really harmful effects in the community. So I think, yes, it can. And I think that the biggest way to help minimize that is obviously organizations making sure that they are taking a hard look at all of their practices, but also making sure that as somebody that is a traveler, you have a lot of responsibility as well to make sure that you're asking the right questions and not perpetuating that as well. So I think there's definitely both sides of it, making sure that organizations are putting forward really good programs that are not perpetuating orphanage trafficking. And then as a traveler, as a responsible traveler, asking really good questions and making sure that you aren't participating in programs that will have negative impacts.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point about taking this personal responsibility and that empowerment to ask those questions. I think sometimes, that's maybe all that organizations need, is just to be asked, because it might just be something that they haven't thought about or it hasn't occurred to them. But I think the more of us that show that this is an issue that is important to us, the quicker that we'll see change happen. Um,
Yeah.
okay, so there are no other questions. Let me just check if any of you guys on Instagram have shared any. I think that's all. So in that case, thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you so much, Brittany, for this conversation. It's been incredibly
Yeah.
helpful and enlightening to hear a bit more about Go Overseas' journey, and how you guys came to the decision that you did. And a huge thank you as well for taking that step, and helping to shift the conversation in the tourism industry.
Yeah. Thank you for, again, having this open dialogue with us. We are looking forward to continuing working with everyone and making sure that we're furthering this mission.
Thank you so much. And thank you
Yeah.
everyone for tuning in. We will be resharing this on our Instagram page and on YouTube and across our social platforms. So do check them out there if you'd like to watch or reshare. And please do visit freedomunited.org to learn more about the campaign and take action. So thank you, Brittany, again, and have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.